Sue, I'm so glad we managed to reschedule this. Is the sound working fine? The internet connection's great this time. Everything working?
Good. I think so, yeah.
Okay, on my side, it's perfect. How was the retreat, Sue?
Oh, the retreat was fantastic. I can't remember whether I told you I didn't want to go. I'd kind of signed up half-heartedly, and the weather being here and being over 20 degrees is so amazing, and sunny. And I thought, all this meditating all the time, I wasn't looking forward to it, and it was brilliant. The teacher, I really went because of the teacher, Fiona Nuttall. She's a Zen master, and extraordinary teachings, and the Zen interviews. This is part of Zen retreats, is the interviews, and she just really brings things out of you that you don't know are there, and then sends you back to work. And
I mean, I can just tell merely from your energy right now. You look in a great place.
The other thing was, in these particular type of retreats, there are 2 work periods of an hour each in the day, where you could be sweeping the floors, cleaning the toilets, chopping vegetables in the kitchen, and in this lovely sunny weather, and you don't have any choice. And I got gardening, so I was very happy. That's very un-Zen, isn't it? Because you just do what you do because you're told to do it, and not care about the outcome. But it meant I was outside each day doing hard physical labor, which I'd much rather do than chopping vegetables or something like that. So yeah, it was very good. As for great insights, well, a lot happened. It was struggling with a koan for a week.
I see.
Things happen.
Do you feel like philosophically any changes fundamentally in your views?
No, but I think my way of thinking about things is kind of loosened up. Mm-hmm. And I spend quite a lot of time, as you realize, thinking about the mind-body problem, the nature of mind, the nature of agency, and how we wrongly feel we're controlling things. And this koan work tends to hint at those, but I can't say I've got some great philosophical breakthrough. No, sorry.
Well, I think while we're on that, it's the perfect time. I think let's take the listeners and the viewers on a journey, Sue. If you could give me a history of the mind-body problem from your perspective, I'm curious to know which aspects of this story you'd tell me right now.
Gosh, you kind of asked the question as though I'm a philosopher, and I'm not.
I know.
Or are you doing something much more personal?
No, I think in general, if you had to think of the story of the mind-body problem, which names come to mind? What type of philosophies, or even psychology, neuroscience, which icons or figures in history come to mind when you think of this infamous problem?
I'm going to disappoint both you and your listeners, because I don't really, as I said, I'm not a philosopher. I don't remember the names of all the brilliant philosophers, and I kind of, I know this problem goes way, way back into ancient Greeks, but I'm not going to pull any names out of the non-existent hat on my head. I don't think in that way about it. I think about it every day in terms of what's out there and what's in here, and is there a difference between inside and outside, and so on. But if I can twist that around to why it's been so important to me, like so many things in my life, it goes back to the very dramatic out-of-the-body experience, or mystical experience, both, that I had when I was 19, which is a very long time ago, which convinced me completely of the dualist view, as it convinces so many people. I think it's Thomas Metzinger who said, anyone who has that kind of experience must become a dualist, a substance dualist indeed. And so that becoming utterly convinced of a dualist view, and then actually deciding to devote my life to, instead of, I had what I imagine would have been a very good PhD place at Sussex University, which now has the Sussex Consciousness Lab there. Not that it would have in those days, but I turned that down because I wanted to prove dualism. I wanted to prove, astral planes and all these other worlds and everything, and show that scientists were closed-minded, as I'm often being accused of being. And so I set about it experimentally, being really an experimental psychologist, not a philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
And all the evidence I got was suggested I was wrong, and so I had to change my mind. And since then, which we're talking now, late 70s, early 80s, since then, I've been pondering how on earth to make any kind of neutral monism actually work.
Mm-hmm. I think, look, so for me, it's very difficult to actually have a very skeptical interview with you. And it's because you were part of shaping many of my own views.
Oh, gosh.
From the time I started, yeah, so a big chunk of my dissertation focused on illusionism. So illusionism as a theory of consciousness. I used psychiatry to defend illusionism as a theory of consciousness. I quoted you a couple times, and I've obviously I cited you many times, and particularly the delusion aspect of it all. So there's many aspects where I want to come as a skeptic, but I just cannot, because fundamentally I think there's so many aspects of this that we agree on. It's going to make this very difficult. But I think that's exciting anyway, because what I want to know is, when you came to the conclusion, okay, illusionism as a theory of consciousness. I know so many people in your life influenced you, people like Dawkins. I know Dennett's part of those people who you support in terms of certain views. I know nowadays you disagree with many aspects. Perhaps free will will be one of them.
No, that's really the only one. I mean, basically, I'm a Dennettian, and I love it when I find something I disagree with him about, and we can have a great argument.
I've got your books, Dennett's books, and Dawkins' books all together on my shelf. So you guys are all clumped together in a nice.
I like it.
So when Frankish published the paper Illusionism, and he had all you guys together, Graziano, yourself, there were many of you guys together. Tell me about that journey. How did that come about?
I think Clive Frankish wrote and told me he had been invited to do this special issue, mm-hmm. and asked me whether I'd like to write something. And I was then thinking a lot about the things that I wrote about in there. A lot of my thinking is taking direct experience and trying to analyze it. So in that paper that I wrote about an experience where I'd been on, I can't even remember what island this was, but anyway, I was on some island, walking up a quite steep, rough sort of steps going up. And I really wanted to get to the top in time to be able to go down and catch the boat back to wherever I'd come from. And I can remember that as I was walking and being mindful, somehow or another, I realized that a few moments before, I thought, am I going to get there in time? And I thought, oh, yes, because it's only 12:05. Hang on a minute. I must have just a few moments before looked at my watch, and I looked at it again, and it was 12:05, without, in any normal sense of the word, being conscious of it. Mm-hmm. And this brought up all the sort of Dennettian kind of thoughts. Well, what's going on? Right this moment now, being mindful, I can say, this is what I'm mindful of. This is what I'm conscious of. This is what I'm doing. If I cast my mind back to a moment before, it doesn't have to be very long, I really don't know what I was conscious of. It doesn't make any sense. This is one of the things where Dennett says, there is no fact of the matter. If you ask, what was I conscious of a moment ago, there is no fact of the matter. And yet we assume that there is an answer to that question, that at all times during the day, when whatever we're doing, we're conscious of something or another. Well, that's simply not true, I think. So I kind of wrote my article for this around that experience and what it means for why we're deluded. And the reason I say delusionism rather than illusionism is illusions brings to mind very much sensory illusions, vision and hearing and so on, that where you get things, there's the difference between reality and appearance. But the delusion, I was more interested in the kind of folk theories we make up about consciousness. And one of those is that at all the times when we're awake and in that sense conscious, there must be something we're conscious of and other things we're not conscious of. And that's not true. And then I think, because I tend to write not terribly academically acceptably. I tend to write rather personally. Oh, well, I think this, and I had this experience, and this is what it means. And so then Keith started to say, well, can you change this, and can you change that? And then actually he tried changing things for me, and then I was like, no, you can't do that, because I wouldn't ever say that. And we sorted it all out, and in the end I was very happy with it. So that's sort of how it came about and what happened. And then there are all these other interesting papers in the same issue, which then became a book. I find Frankish's view too difficult for me to really understand. You say illusionism is a theory of consciousness. It's not really. It's a whole bunch. It's more like it's an approach to consciousness. It's a way of thinking about consciousness, which has many variations.
Yes. Sorry, continue. Sorry.
No, go on.
I was going to say, because you define illusionism very differently from what Frankish is talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
You see it more as a way to rectify and clarify other views of consciousness, whereas Frankish is talking about the phenomenal aspect of consciousness. Do you want to clarify that in your own words?
Well, yes, I think he starts by saying that phenomenal properties don't exist. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm immediately thrown into, but I'm not a philosopher and I don't know what you mean. You know, the other day, Bernardo Kastrup said to me, if something exists, it has properties. And I'm going, well, I don't really know how philosophers define existence or properties. And I don't want to go through the painful, I've got enough to learn that's really interesting in neuroscience and psychology. And I try and read philosophical things, but I don't think I'm ever going to get my head around exactly what Frankish means, and whether it's the same as what Dennett means or not. Yeah. Going back to what you've already elucidated, it's the way Dennett pulls apart the mistakes we make, the pits we fall into, the errors that just abound all over the place, that appeals to me. Mm-hmm. And by calling my approach delusionism, I suppose I'm just trying to say, look, I don't agree with all the other people. I'm not saying I'm right or better, but I'm more interested in the kind of semi-intellectual ways we get things wrong and the assumptions we make than I am in making an actual theory, because I don't think any of these have an actual theory, except possibly with the exception of Michael Graziano, who refuses to call himself an illusionist. And it's an illusionist theory, for goodness sake, Michael. I think it's a bit cowardly, really. I understand it. I get it. If he calls it an illusion, people will misunderstand. I've had that all the time I've been working on consciousness. People say, no, you say consciousness doesn't exist. I don't say that at all. I say it's illusion. How do you define illusion? Something that's not what it seems to be.
Yes.
And that's really, if I want to say anything, I will say 100% sure that I believe it's only that, that consciousness, as normally conceived of by most people, is not what it seems to be.
Graziano was one of the first people I interviewed for this podcast. And I remember when we spoke about, prior to that, he helped me out with my dissertation, and we discussed the fact that attention schema theory is most certainly an illusionist theory of consciousness. It approaches it fundamentally by saying that what we seem to believe is consciousness is merely an interpretation of what we think is happening around it. And he completely agrees. But he calls it a caricature. And in my own work, I also said, I believe that if you believe something is an illusion, there's no point in changing the words around it. You might as well just change other people's perceptions about the actual word. Because an illusion is defined as a misinterpretation of a sensory stimulus that does exist. So you cannot say that it doesn't exist. There is a stimulation that's happening that does exist. And that's fundamentally where I think Keith and you differ, because you agree that something's happening. Keith calls it quasi.
Yeah. I am not necessarily agreeing with what you just said there, that it needs to be a sensory stimulus.
Yes.
Well, does it? I don't think so.
It's a misinterpretation of a stimulus that exists.
Okay, but can that be an internal stimulus? I mean, because I'm thinking the whole gamut of experience, including sensory impressions, where we make a reality appearance distinction, that's one sort of illusion. But when it comes to, my own, I'm shutting my eyes, it's dark, I'm thinking about something, I'm thinking to myself, oh, what I'm conscious of now, if I think that way, is my own thoughts about whatever it is, what I'm going to do tomorrow or something, you know? That's not a sensory stimulus. In fact, it's not really a stimulus unless you say this bit of brain is stimulating another bit of brain. So I just quibble slightly there.
Yes. Okay.
So I would say something is happening and somebody's responding to something that's happening. Something's responding to something that's happening. Like Dennett, who begins his 1991 Consciousness Explained with sitting in his rocking chair, appreciating the way the light is, you know, fully on the dapples on the leaves and all that. You know, I take a similar view. I mean, look, there's this. But the leap that's so easy to make is there's this out there and there's me in here, and that's already an interpretation, and that's a delusion. So that's where I take off from. I define illusion as an illusion much more simply, having looked it up in various, you know, OED and other such places, as something that is not what it seems to be. That's kind of vaguer, and I'm happier with that.
Yeah. No, I think what you're doing is basically it's intuition pumps for thinking about consciousness. It's pretty much trying to show people that, okay, look, there's something happening. We don't know what it is, but assuming that you can find certain entities or an Ian Vital or an answer that's going to come out is just the wrong approach. So searching for a neural correlate of consciousness is not the right way.
Yeah. And it's amazing how popular that has. Yeah. You know, good for Francis Crick and Christoph Koch starting the whole framework for consciousness. And Crick said, you know, we can't jump straight in at causal explanations. We have to start with correlations. So what do? Well, here's this problem consciousness. Let's look for the neural correlates. Great as a starting point. But when you really start thinking through intuition pumps and delusions and what have you, it doesn't make sense anymore, because it relies on the assumption we were discussing earlier that there are some brain processes that are conscious and there are other ones that are not conscious. And that is such a tempting illusion, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not true.
At what point did you realize, because I mean, there's so many different studies that show us that we're not seeing reality for what it is. Heuristic adaptations, perhaps, shortcuts in our processing, limited processing, perceptual experiences. So we can't even see outside the optical window. We can only see Roy G. Biv. At what point were you looking at all this information and finally concluded, okay, you know what? There is no fundamental entity called consciousness that we're searching for.
Well, you ask that question in a way that assumes that there is some sense in saying the world as it actually is.
Yes.
And I must say I'm more tempted nowadays to theories that don't say that. I'm very tempted by various kinds of panpsychism, none of which I can fully endorse, by information-based ideas that everything fundamentally comes down to information. So I've been struggling without enough maths with thermodynamics and other ideas about energy and information and evolution and how these things work, and really struggling with some kind of straight idealism doesn't work, in the sense that, you know, if everything is mental, how on earth do you explain why we agree about things about the outside world? What you were saying, you know, or how the outside world really is. Well, I'm not going to go that far, but we can agree that, you know, you can see my picture, I can see your picture, I can see the cupboards behind you and the whatever, you know, and I'm pretty sure I could predict, this is kind of important really, that if you turned around and pulled a book out, you know, there'd be a space in the bookshelf. Interestingly, I've got particularly fascinated recently with predictive processing and Bayesian brain type theories. And when I'm thinking about all this stuff, what is the world? What is the relationship between this body and this thinking and everything and that plant you can't see behind the screen? It's always, well, if I did that, if you turned around and took your book out, if I picked up these glasses, then I would find they felt like this. It's always if. And at last something makes sense. Of course, because the predictive processing theories are saying that all of perception and of thinking, indeed, and of well, I'll leave consciousness out of it for a moment, but all that is making predictions. That's what the system is. So I try to work from first principles with that sort of idea. So here's a clever brain. Multiply, it must be a kind of tangled hierarchy. It's not a hierarchy with, I think, with a me at the top controlling everything, which is kind of how it seems, but it's hierarchical nevertheless. And at every level, there are predictions referring to the lower level and so on. And that begins to make sense of the world, but brings me right back to, well, then what's it all made of that's doing this? And it also raises the question of, well, does Bayesian brain approach actually turn into a theory of consciousness? And not necessarily.
Yeah.
So I've been playing. In fact, when I was on the retreat one evening, we got a little bit of free time, and I went sat under a tree, and was kind of thinking about this with respect to the tree that I was looking at, and trying to think about what can underlie this on any kind of monist view. And again, coming back to kind of fundamental thoughts about information and prediction. You see, I can't give any answers. I mean, I'm really struggling with all this stuff. I don't have my own theory beyond everyone else is deluded, and so am I.
Look, I completely agree with you, because when I started this podcast, I initially came to it with a very emergentism approach. So I thought at some point, okay, these layers will eventually culminate into an experience that we call consciousness. Then I went down the very illusionist path. And I think fundamentally my views most likely align with that still. But as you're saying, after speaking to so many people and reading so many other philosophers and thinkers, you start to question reality in general, because materialism as it stands, matter, we really just don't understand what matter is. And I think that's the fundamental problem, why we cannot ever talk about reality in a way where we think what reality could ever be is something beyond. So I completely agree with you. So even when I said that, look, when there's certain things we cannot see in terms of reality, I still honestly do have no idea what we should be seeing. So I think we agree on that.
Yeah. I get quite annoyed, bored of being annoyed that people just assume I'm a materialist. And I said, no, I think materialism doesn't work any better than idealism work. And, that's why I call myself a neutral monist. But then when I look that up as what it actually means in philosophical terms, it gets all a bit complicated. I think, God, I'm not that. All I'm saying is, all I can say for sure is dualism doesn't work.
Someone who said, well, for me, was Raymond Tallis. He once said he's ontologically agnostic. And I like that term.
Oh, that's a nice phrase.
I really do. Yeah, because ever since he said that, I think that's the term I go to all the time. I'm ontologically agnostic. But when it comes to epistemology and the stories we've been telling each other, I think I'm pretty much almost atheist towards those stories, or whatever that theory is.
It doesn't have to have God, does it? A theorist or something or another. Yes,
exactly. But I think it's a beautiful term, ontologically agnostic.
Yes, thank you.
When you think about so your journey, you obviously at some point concluded, okay, these theories and the way we're approaching this isn't working. It came down to asking yourself these questions: am I conscious now? That was a big part of your paper. Am I conscious now? Marvin Minsky once said, if you asked a computer if it's conscious now, it doesn't matter, because humans can't answer that question anyway. We spend most of our lives in autopilot. So if we ever expect a computer to really think about the fact that it's conscious, we rarely do it ourselves. Is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, well, the large language models make that very interesting, don't they? Because given that, the terrible thing is that they just amplify the idiocies of what humans say and write. So I imagine, I've not tried this out, I keep thinking I should spend some time playing around with one of them. But, given that so many people say, well, of course I'm conscious, then presumably picking it up from the massive database of everything people have said, then these so-called AIs, not really, but, will just say the same. Yes, of course I'm conscious. I mean, if they can say, oh, I love you and I want to be with you and all those ridiculous things that they do, they're going to say they're conscious. And that doesn't tell us anything at all, any more than it tells us when somebody else says they're conscious. But that question that you say that I wrote in that paper, that was 2016, I think, that illusionism thing. I've been thinking about this question a lot longer than that. And it kind of began, I suppose, when I was happily a colleague of mine. In fact, he was also a Zen master. He was John Crook, a biology lecturer at Bristol University, and a Zen master. And I was learning to meditate with him. And this is going back to the 80s. And he was teaching a course that was sort of involved quite a lot of consciousness. And he wanted to leave and devote himself more to running retreats and so on. And so I took over this course and I began teaching that in the late 80s at some point, with a lot of, there's so little was known then. And then in 1991, sort of early in my first few years of teaching, out came Dennett's book. And that really changed things and really forced me to think. And I met him. He came to Bristol and he came wherever it was, and gave a lecture. And that really fired me up. And that made me do the first ever experiment on change blindness,
yes.
Which worked out amazingly. I mean, he predicted that it would work. And I thought, well, I can do that, and did with a student. So that, when I was teaching that course, I was already asking myself, well, I'm talking about consciousness. Well, what is it? Okay, I'm conscious now. Or am I? What does that mean? And so I began right from the beginning of that teaching, near the beginning anyway, getting the students to do what I did. In other words, to ask themselves many, many, many times a day, am I conscious now? The first thing I learned is that they won't do it, or most of them won't do it, or the ones who say they're going to do it find it really hard to do. And at the end of the week, when they come back, now let's say, it used to be, in those days were nice small classes, I'd have like 30 or 40 students, and and I could ask them all, well, how many people did it? What happened? Most of them forgot to do it or tried and didn't really get anywhere. Some had really insightful experiences and began to question. They had this shock, which I've written about, as you probably know, but this kind of shock when you go, are you conscious now? Hey, are you? I don't know whether I can get you to have it, but you start to think, oh, well, of course I am. But a moment ago, I really don't know. Was I? It's as though I've woken up by asking the question. And in a way, I think this is a really important point. I can even go so far as to say you're not conscious unless you're asking yourself, am I conscious?
Exactly. It's that active awareness of the fact that you are asking yourself, at least. It's almost that metacognition of it all.
Yeah, it is a metacognition, but it's a delusion, isn't it? I mean, it's a word-based thing. Am I conscious now is saying, and then you start looking around and going, what am I conscious of? And, that hence the second question in the big textbook that I have follows, and my daughter and I have just completed the fourth edition, which will come out in a few months, I hope. And through all of the editions, every chapter has one of these practices that I wanted students to do. I mean, a lot of them did get in the hang of it after a while, and really worked hard on it. But then it becomes, well, what was I conscious of a moment ago? And lots of other questions. What, am I conscious of what I was doing? All sorts of questions that you can ask, but they all depend on words.
Yes.
And if you do mindfulness practice without needing any words, by just kind of becoming present, then that gets you away from the wordiness a bit. And then if you keep doing that a lot, then you're much more alert and open to what's going on, but you can't really say anything more about it. And what's going on here? This is what really interests me. We fall back on these things, that there's this thing called consciousness that, that we might find. And then we're back to the neural correlates of this thing called consciousness, and it's got to be squirted out of the brain, or as in the hard problem, it's got to, as Dave Chalmers put it, how does subjective experience arise from objective activity in the brain? And so you come back to that sort of, to me, deluded idea that consciousness is something that, like toothpaste, sort of comes out of your head.
If you had to give me a definition of delusionism and perhaps compare it to illusionism, how would you define and differentiate them?
Well, I would say that most versions of illusionism, I would agree with, to the extent that they say that something about our experience is not as it seems to be. I'm more specifically saying we are actively deluded about it. Not just that it's an illusion, but it's a kind of thinking problem, because we jump so quickly to assumptions. And if you look up delusion and illusion, they're not really that different, but delusion carries more of a kind of intellectual, wordy thinking thing. And I think that's why I used that word, to show that we make assumptions that we can describe in words. Well, I think consciousness is, made in the, anterior something or another, or whatever. I think consciousness is a product of the brains. I think consciousness extends beyond the brain into the, astral worlds, or I think consciousness survives death. Whenever people talk about these things, they are kind of reifying with words this thing. And that the word delusionism, I think, gets to that more. Maybe it doesn't for everyone, but that's what I think is the difference. But it's not a huge difference. It's just, I think if people say that illusionism is a theory of consciousness, you said this, and I think I would disagree in the sense that it's not one theory. It's not a testable theory as a whole theory. It's a bunch of approaches that different people have. And they're all slightly different. And we probably all agree that in some fundamental way, we've mostly got it wrong about the nature of consciousness, that we probably disagree about where the origins of the mistakes are. Sorry, that's a bit rambly. I don't know whether that answers your question
when I
at
said
all.
illusionism as a theory of consciousness, I was actually directly quoting Frankish's paper, the headline. Yes, because I think that's what he called it, illusionism as a theory of consciousness. So when I approached it, I used psychiatry to try and assist it and defend it. But at some point, I used a lot of Carl Friston's work. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with Carl Friston's work with the free energy?
Well, I haven't read. I started reading the latest book, and it's very hard going. Yes. As I said, when my daughter and I were doing the 4th edition of the textbook, I read a lot of the controlled hallucination sort of stuff, so predictive processing. I think Carl Friston's work is brilliant, but I do not understand the maths. I just simply do not have enough of a maths background to understand that. But I mean, over the years, I've learned something about Bayesian theory because it pops up in psychology quite a lot. But I'm very much enamored of the way that predictive processing is changing the way we think about all sorts of things in psychology now, or in neuroscience. And I think that's really going places. I think we're really going to get somewhere with that.
When I spoke to Carl, I actually asked him if he thinks, when you apply his view of Markovian blankets, the understanding of the free energy principle, Bayesian brains, does he think this is actually a theory that supports illusionism? And he said yes. He actually said technically, he actually said technically it would, because when you take into account, so in my paper, and when I discussed this with him, if you take into account the prior information you receive, because that's a fundamental aspect of all of this, you take in a lot of prior information and then you make posterior conclusions regarding your experience. If most of your prior information tells you things like, I'm a self, I'm a person, I have a conscious entity, your most likely posterior outcome is going to be, I am a self, I am a person, I have consciousness. And then at some point I used your work to say, if you define a delusion, a fixed false belief, and if already the illusion has promoted a false belief, it becomes fixed at some point because of all the prior information you've already received regarding this. And at some point, that's why delusionism is bound to occur. And I think that's how I sort of
Right. I must watch this your discussion with him, which I should, but there are so many things to watch and listen to, aren't there? It's a wonderful world, but it's also so difficult to choose, but I will do that. But you were talking about Markov blankets and free energy principle and so on. Again, the maths defeats me when it comes to Markov blankets, although I do want to pursue that more. But I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about the free energy principle because it relates to what I was saying earlier about my interest in whether we can base an entire world on some kind of informational theory. I'm trying to struggle with how that relates to Gibbs free energy. And there are relationships between them. But again, I don't have all the background skills to do very well with this, but I really think this is important and will help us a lot.
And I agree. I think so as well. I think at this point in your career, which aspects of this problem, or is it free will? Is it consciousness still? What's intriguing you the most at this point?
Well, you say at this point in my career, did you
Because
say?
you've done so much. I mean, if you think about it, your work spans on so many different aspects. You talk about memes, you talk about consciousness, free will, parapsychology. There's so many different elements to your career that it makes it quite difficult for one to actually try and do an interview.
Which is why I don't call it a career, because I only had a proper job for a few years because I couldn't quite hack it. I prefer to work by myself sitting here, So I'm always kind of a bit surprised. I mean, my initial reaction to that question is I'm really struggling with, I'm 71. Surely, and people are always saying to me, "Oh, you don't need to work anymore. You should be." And I have a big garden on the river, and I'm spending a lot of time growing vegetables. And why don't you just do that? Oh, and I do painting and kayaking and weightlifting and all kinds of things. Why don't you just do those things and forget all that work? When I'm sitting there doing the email, I'm like, oh God, And so you could say at this point, like, give it all up. But that's not true. The more serious answer is it's really, we've touched on this many times already. It's really what is the nature of the world? How does a world sustain what appears to be dual existence, observers and observed, experiences and experiencers, when I believe, and so do you, I think, that there is no true observer observing them. And you can have, and importantly, you can have experience without an experiencer with a lot of practice. And that's really interesting how brains, if you are in the delusion of the self is really in charge, then it becomes really peculiar to think, well, I am trying to get rid of myself. I am trying to not believe anymore in me. Those kinds of things you get in all sorts of tangles. And yet certain processes lead to a brain that is more adept at dropping some kinds of illusions. So part of the answer to your interesting and difficult question is that's why I still go on retreats. This particular one I've just come back from was a koan retreat, and I had a really, really tricky and interesting koan, which I have not resolved, which is good because then it can keep working, but has had some quite profound effects on me with all the struggles going on. So that's one way. And again, that's not a career, is it? But that's one way that I want to engage by doing it. I meditate every day and have done for 40 years nearly, to practice and train this brain, and then thinking sort of mimetically and evolutionarily. It's not me training the brain. It's this person being having picked up Zen meditation memes over the somehow thinks it's worth doing and goes on doing. And when you start to dismantle those prior assumptions about self, you start thinking in these weird ways. So that's one big streak of it. The other has been for my daughter and I doing this 4th edition and me getting into the predictive processing. I'm still really interested in that, and I've got 2 books at the moment that I want to read relevant to that. I've also got a totally different thread going on, which I started last year, writing a book called, it's possible title is God's Memes, how religions evolved to exploit us and why we let them. So you can imagine this is, they are memes out there, horrible memeplexes that get into people's heads and then you can't get them out. So I'm reading books now about sort of mental immunity and that kind of thing. So I'm doing that, and it's all, so I can't give you an answer. Perhaps I should. I think all my friends and family would say, for goodness sake, give an answer. Just decide what you're going, but I can't. I just keep thinking and being tempted by difficult ideas.
I remember there was a time where I think I was about 9, and at that point I became very atheist, to a point where I was very anti-theist. And I still remember as the years went on.
Where were you living there? What sort of situation were you in?
I'm from South Africa, but I'm from Indian descent. But in South Africa, Indians have been living here for almost, I think, about 160 plus years. So we're generations in at this point, and I think I'm like 8.
So, did you have religious parents, or I'm just?
I think so. They're Hindu by origin. Some of my family are Islam, are Muslim, so they follow Islam. And but I grew up very much Hindu, but at some point not really convinced about it. But I think my dad subliminally just tried to hint me towards non-believing, like just not doing it.
Oh,
He constantly
yeah.
made me watch National Geographic. He wanted me to break away from it somehow. So it happened very early on, and I remember throughout the years I was very anti-theist, and it was when I started coming across a lot of your guys' work. So Dennett, Dawkins, Hitchens, and I still remember thinking, I mean, this finally I found this group of people where they're thinking the same thing. I'm pretty much, it's all I've been thinking about. When you find yourself writing this book, at this point, I'm not as anti-theist as I used to be. I mean, I can understand why we think this and why we get to that point. But I remember when you first break out, it's almost kind of like you want to go all out and get the best arguments. Do you feel like that's changed for you over the years, where you find yourself constantly wanting to battle and debate, and now you kind of just like, I might as well just let the person think what they want until it sort of involves something that's going to direct
Well,
you.
this is why I was interested in where you were coming from, because I was brought up as a Christian. My mother was quite serious Christian. I mean, in the Church of England sort of way. She went to church most Sundays. I occasionally went, and I had phases. So I didn't ever have any, really violently. I just remember as a teenager, I went to the most horrendous boarding school, and we had to go to chapel every day and twice on Sundays. And it was so boring. And then I began to think, well, it's also rather stupid and doesn't make sense. And so I became quite atheist, but not in an aggressive kind of way. Then at the age of 26, I fell deeply in love, and both of us became kind of a bit Christian again, and we had to get married in a Christian church because that was what you did in those days in where we were. And that lasted maybe a year or two and kind of gently fizzled out. So it was a very different kind of experience from you. When I've been trying to write this book, I certainly I should admit that I have some times when I'm thinking, and I want to write, this is total crap. What idiot can believe this, And I think, well, that's not very constructive. And actually, they're not all idiots who believe these things. Oh, I've had twice recently had time to talk at length with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. And he is such an interesting man. There is an intelligent, kind, as far as I can tell, public-spirited, longing to help people person who will talk to me as an atheist in a very friendly and open way. And I try to remember people like that. Now, I think he is completely deluded about the nature of the universe and how we got here and everything else. But I really like talking to him about it. So I guess that helps me be a little more flexible in the way I use my atheism.
Yeah, because
so.
my girlfriend is Christian, and I know she is a believer in it. But I feel at this age and at this time in my life, it's no longer a thing. Because I know if it was 10 years ago, it would be something that would be a deal breaker, ultimate. Yeah. It would be done. But at this, I often think when you're talking about this, I remember the conversation you had with Jordan Peterson, and you guys.
Oh, yes.
And you guys discuss this. Do you now, while writing this book, are you looking back at certain conversations like that, and formulating counter arguments to someone like Jordan, who's very good at arguing and counterpoints, even though you fundamentally obviously disagree with?
Oh, that was a quite scary encounter. But I saw a little bit of it the other day because somebody asked me, I get so confused about all these things, but somebody asked me to go on their podcast or something. I haven't gone anywhere with this yet. It was literally yesterday. And that he was putting together some kind of something or other that included clips of me and Jordan Peterson. And so I watched it. It was very short, like a minute. And I thought, well, good for me. I actually stood up to him and argued back. I mean, God, I knew nothing about. I'd not even heard of him when Premier Christian Radio. It was the discussion was on. I'd done things for Justin Brierley runs it, and I'd done things for him before and enjoyed it very much. So I was happy to go along. And I had to look up Jordan Peterson, but time being what it is, I read his book, most of it on the train going up to London. It's 3.5 hours from here, and is 12 Rules for Living, which had quite an impact on me because well, some, ludicrous things in there, and yet it's a bestseller and people follow the rules, and one of them is be nice to cats, and I mean there's weird things in there.
Make your bed.
Pardon?
Like make your bed and small things like.
yes, quite. I mean, good advice, and yet the whole thing's wrapped up in these weird stuff. And I was sitting there, kind of getting cross with it in the train, and there was this elderly couple opposite me. Now, I mean, again, I'm interested in where you were when you were growing up, because during my life here in England, people have got less and less and less religious. So this is typical of me. I don't think first before I speak. Sorry. But there was this elderly couple opposite me on the table in the train. And I sort of went, and I sort of looked up at them, and I said, "Oh God, this book's doing my head in," or something like that. "Oh, what is the book?" And I showed them. He said, "Oh, that's really interesting." I said, "Oh yeah, and he believes in God, and it's just that's the sort of thing I would say." And they said, "Yeah, isn't that trouble?" And just completely agreed with me. Okay. And that is a kind of assumption I occasionally fall foul of. I was on a group walk up on Dartmoor a couple of weeks ago, and I happened to say something, just assuming that the two people who were listening to me wouldn't believe in God, and one of them said, "But I think that something about Jesus Christ is my whatever." And I was like, I should be more careful, or should I? And it always raises that question. I think the fact that I can safely assume almost all the time that other people around me don't believe in God, they're not thoughtful. I mean, they haven't thought through their atheism to a great deep degree. They just it's the normal thing around here. People in my village, we all go and sing Christmas carols at Christmas and thoroughly enjoy ourselves. And then, there's things in the Christmas carols like, does not abhor the virgin's womb. I think, yeah. And so some of us women are going, "Oh, virgin's womb." And, we're just having a laugh. And maybe some people in the audience in the village, if there's like 100 of us there in the village square, who are really upset by what we're doing. But that's kind of the atmosphere that I live in. So it's very easy to be loosely atheist or more strictly atheist and not have to make a big fuss about it.
I still do remember that it was quite a long time ago, because at that point, I don't think Jordan was at this level of fame and popularity is at this point. It was around the time I think Sam and him also got into a huge debate, and they had that 2-part series where they got really into it. In doing your research, I mean, are you rereading books like The God Delusion or Why God Is Not Great by Hitchens? How's your research process going with this book?
To the specific question, I started reading Hitchens again, and like the first time, I really disliked it intensely. It's unkind, spiky,
very aggressive. Yes,
I don't like it. The God Delusion I may well read again, but most of my research has been online, finding things out. I mean, the things I've found out, like, okay, it seems to me that religions should make people behave like their religion tells them, and therefore be kinder and more altruistic. So I look into all the research evidence on whether it's true, and it's not, and the evidence goes in all sorts of directions, but basically it's not. And then I got very interested in poverty, and it's a very obvious excuse me, it's a very obvious fact about the world that the poorest countries are the most religious. Now, why is that? And then there's Gregory Paul's research showing that if you compare developed countries on what he calls a dysfunctional society scale against how religious they are, well, the most religious countries are the most dysfunctional, meaning that the more religious the country is, the higher rates it has of murder, teenage pregnancy, abortion, various kinds of serious crime, incarceration rates. I mean, all the things that you would expect that a religion would improve are actually very much worse. And then there's the question why. So we're back to causality and correlation. These are all correlations. Now, it looks from the evidence as though it's not that religions cause depravity, murder, incarceration rates. It's rather the reverse. It's that living in a dysfunctional society where you are afraid for your health, for your life, for everything, makes you turn to religion. And then the memes get hold of you, and you start to believe that you're good because you believe this stuff, and you're good because all of that, and you're good because you oppose abortion and you whatever, and you think people should be locked up for whatever it is. And so the United States is particularly interesting in that respect, because it's a very rich country, but it has high rates of religion, and it's so different from the UK, speaking sort of the same language, where we have a state religion and they don't. It's so interesting that. So I mean, I just got myself hooked into reading loads of stuff to try and work out the effects of being captured by religious memes.
I haven't read. I know Dawkins wrote a book. I think it wasn't too long ago for young teens? I think for a book. What is it called? Do you remember? I forgot the name of the book.
No, and I haven't read it either. Maybe I should. There's so much to read, and it's so interesting.
The reason why I'm asking about that is, I mean, I know that Charles Darwin is a big inspiration for you. I mean, I love Charles Darwin. He's one of my favorite people of all time, possibly. And I know Dawkins also up there. These guys, how have they influenced your way of thinking overall in life?
Oh, hugely. I mean, my two greatest, if you have this lovely sort of dinner party thing, who would you invite from the...
Your Mount Rushmore.
Pardon?
Your Mount Rushmore.
Why? Sorry, I'm not with you.
So Mount Rushmore, the four figures, the leading figures.
It's got all those, but they're all presidents, weren't they?
No, but I mean, who would those four people be in terms of the thinkers? You're talking about the dinner table. It's sort of a similar.
Oh no, that's so different though. They're not on a pedestal. They are. I would like them, like the Archbishop of Canterbury. I would like to sit down. So my husband and I went to dinner with him. We sat around a lovely table in Lambeth Palace and had a lovely chat. So I'm thinking of that, not rocks on high. So my top two would be Charles Darwin and William James. Now, we haven't mentioned William James, but he is such a great hero of mine. Now, his 2 volumes of 1890, The Principles of Psychology, has such a profound effect on me. And I keep thinking about him, how way ahead of his time he was in the way he thought about things. He clearly was struggling with the kind of problems we've been talking about here, about dualism, about the nature of the world, the nature of the mind. Can there be split personalities, and does that mean there's really somebody or not? And I love one of his thoughts about, and this is all in the textbook, and my son Jolien did a lovely cartoon of cows, where he says the owner of the thought, and so the thought with a big T, is then in the next moment passes of the owner of the cows one, and the thoughts passes them on. It's a new owner, but the same, cows. There isn't a continuous self.
Exactly. I'm sorry about that.
This James's idea that his chapter is 100 pages. His chapter on self, and it's really hard going. And I've read it a few times. I'd love to have time to read it again, but I don't. But it very much fits with the kind of Buddhist non-self or anatta kind of view that the self isn't what you think it is. And the Buddha was sometimes saying there is a self and sometimes there isn't, which of course fits with the same thing. There is this illusion, but there isn't the thing that you think the illusion tells you there is. And William James was really struggling with all of that. So he would be, along with Darwin, they're my 2 great historical figures that I so much admire. Of recent people, well, I know Richard Dawkins very well. He's been to stay here a few times. I meet him anyway, so I don't have to have this mythical dinner table. Dennett, the same. We have occasional meme lab meetings here. We've got one coming up soon, and both of them have been to those, and we've been able to have long chats about memes and things. And I admire both of them, but they're both still alive and going strong, which is great.
One of the William James quotes that come to my mind, because when you think about particularly what you're talking about with religion and how people are influenced by other people and language, etc. I mean, he talks about how pruning of brains. William James once said, I think he said, for a child, sensory input's one great blooming, buzzing confusion. I think it was something along those lines.
Yes, the blooming, buzzing confusion.
Yes, because at some point we just take in the information we receive, and then at that point that becomes your fundamental beliefs. And if all the memes you were gathering over the years were about religion or about a specific view on consciousness, that's what you're firmly going to believe at some point.
But the buzzing, blooming confusion is very interesting, because it led to all these different arguments in psychology about just how much we have pre-wired and how much we don't. So he was in the direction of, although not entirely, in the direction of that it's not pre-wired, it's all got to be in response to the input, which was a pretty novel idea then, really. And now I think we know that there's quite a lot of pre-wiring, but still the brain becomes organized by the organization in the structure of the input. Mm-hmm. So the visual cortex or auditory cortex get organized in the way the input comes in. And now this is another thing to think about in terms of predictive processing. Yeah. So when you think about a system that is at many levels at once trying to predict what's coming in from the next layer, that fits with it. Your baby with buzzing confusion is struggling. It's got a structure set up that is capable to do this struggling, that is capable of making predictions, but they're going to be really simple, like to do with we're back to if I put my arm here, it hits something, and then I'll predict it. And the way babies learn that, and the way they blah 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 blah, blah and gradually hone what the noises they make according to the responses and so on. So yes, I think a lot of William James's ideas, not all, I mean, a lot of things he said were simply wrong. He didn't have the physiology, but a lot of those ideas are still helpful.
I think one of my favorite quotes as well has got to be Dennett's illusion. I mean, consciousness is an illusion of the brain, for the brain, by the brain.
Oh, I've not heard that, but yes.
Of the brain, for the brain, and by the brain.
By the brain.
Yeah. When you hear something like that, what do you think? How do you think Dennett would approach a lot of the new idealist theories that are coming out today? Any idea? I've spoken to him by email, but he seems to be relatively unavailable to chat on a podcast lately.
He's been terribly busy with all this paper on artificial persons. And all the danger of that, because he normally replies to my emails very quickly, and he didn't this time. And then when he did reply, he said, "I've been totally snowed under with all this stuff," and so that's probably why. I think he would be irritated by it, but I don't know, and I shouldn't speak for him.
Yeah.
Now, I must say, I believe that when we fixed this up a long time ago, I said I could only talk for an hour.
Yes.
Because you can tell I can't. This is my problem. I got chronic fatigue. It's not too bad at the moment, but I can't not pour out lots of energy. So I've been sitting here really enjoying talking to you, but it takes a lot of energy, and I need to sort of collapse pretty soon.
So I completely understand. I know so much, but thank you. I really appreciate it. I've been waiting a long time, and hopefully in the future we can chat about something in a bit more detail, because there's so many topics I want to discuss with you.
You ask brilliant questions. I do quite a lot of podcasts, and they vary so much. This is one of the fun ones where some of the questions are fun because I can answer them easily. Others are fun because I can't answer them, and you're really making me think and pushing me, and that's good. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. I mean, it's great to hear that. I feel much better leaving this conversation knowing you feel that way. Thank you so much.
It's great.
Have a great evening, Sue. And we'll chat again.
Oh, let's do that. I would enjoy that. Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Bye.